Hello everybody, good afternoon and welcome to the fourth session of the Global Built Environment Summit. It's been running this last couple of days. We're going to be talking this afternoon about modern methods of construction. So if we can move on to a little bit of housekeeping. First of all, it is a listen-only webinar. It will be recorded. We're very keen to hear your questions via the Q&A function. There'll be Q&A throughout the session after people's presentations, so please do submit your questions and we can go through those. If you do have any technical difficulties, please submit your issue via the Q&A function as well. Afterwards, we'll be completing a feedback survey. And we'll also send a link to everybody with a recording of the webinar in due course as well. So like all our events, this is a CPD recognised webinar. So please don't forget to request your certificate via the feedback survey following the event this afternoon. So I'm Claire Price. I'm a sector lead in the built environment team here at BSI. Modern methods of construction is one of my focus areas, along with sustainable construction and competence in the built environment. So I thought I'd do a brief introduction, if we can just move on, and think about, I'll go through the agenda first. So we're going to be hearing from Mark Farmer, first of all. He's going to be doing our State of the Nation address about UK progress towards increasing pre-manufacturing in the country. We'll be hearing from Matthew Egan, who's our new chair of a brand new BSI Technical Committee CB301. For offsite construction. We'll then be hearing from Ryan Kolker, Vice President of the International Code Council from the US. And then we'll hear from Ben Carlisle, who'll be talking about the Platform Rulebook that came out earlier this year. And we're expecting to close at 4 o'clock this afternoon. Okay. So just by way of introduction, I did want to really have a think about the role of BSI in innovation. MMC, off-site construction, prefabrication, it's not new, but it has been around for a long time, but it still isn't a major part of our built environment yet. And there's been a lot of treatment of it as a new area. And for us, certainly on standardization, it's very much a new area. But I did want to talk a little bit about the role of BSI in innovation. I think really it's important to think that and to understand that on the process side and on the output side, in terms of the standards output, it really is, we really are a great enabler of innovation. Because of the way we work, we convene communities, we bring people together for them to look at what good looks like in particular areas. We facilitate and help them to reach agreement via consensus. The documents we produce define terminology, test methods, they develop best practice. And these are really vital in new areas, in the early stages of innovative products and processes. We disseminate all the standards. They're in the public domain. They're available for everybody to use, and they embed knowledge, help to embed knowledge in markets. We offer different types of deliverables, different types and different ways of working. We have our BSI Flex process, which is an iterative approach, which is particularly useful for brand new areas. We have our fast track standard, the PAS documents, and then the more formal output, which are developed over a longer period of time through our existing standing technical committees. All of the documents are living documents. They undergo regular review and revision, either 2-year or 5-year maintenance cycle. And all of our documents are developed within an established standards landscape. We have around 50,000 standards in our catalogue. And when we are working with industry to develop new standards, we do liaise across, we do check that they work within an existing standards framework. We're not reinventing the wheel. We connect out to documents that exist already, so that any new areas work within that existing landscape. And I've just flagged up a couple of documents there that highlight new areas that we've been working in recently. CAV, or Connected and Automated Vehicles, this a project we've been working on with the DFT, and hydrogen-fired gas appliances, that guide, again, a brand new area where we've been working with Hy4Heat and government to develop that. So next slide, please. So the standards themselves, you know, they do establish quality and performance through benchmarking, and that really enables scale up by standardizing deliverables. Scale up is possible for industry. The documents themselves facilitate communication along the supply chain. You don't need to explain what you want to a supplier. If you can point at a standard and say, do that, you know, it's a great deal easier than having to explain everything each time. And all of this helps to reduce risk in assurance and finance, and grow best practice. Nationally and internationally, our standards can be elevated to ISO and IEC level, and that's a really good route to exporting for our industry and across the world. And all of this helps to increase certainty and gives some certainty for return on investment as well. I just thought I'd mention that it's not just brand new areas. You know, the standards can actually help to develop existing areas of work, and certainly all the work we've been doing under the new building safety regime for DLUC post-Grenfell is all about changing culture, and that work is ongoing very much. Next slide, please. So what have we been doing? What have I been doing in the last few years around off-site construction? We've been engaging with industry on this subject for quite a few years now. We commissioned Loughborough University to carry out some research for us looking at standards for off-site construction, and that was published in 2019. It is still available, so do go and look at that. It's got some very useful information, some key recommendations in there about the existing portfolio of standards in this area, very few, and what we might need to do to improve things. One of the key recommendations, of course, is to make sure that existing standards can work for the offsite sector. You know, there are over 1,250 standards that are referenced in building regs and construction products regulations, and the vast majority of those were written for the traditional building practice. So what do we do to accommodate the offsite sector within those? And BS 5606 was the first standard, well-established, long-established standard for accuracy and tolerance in design and construction that was revised and published this year to incorporate some requirements for the offsite sector. We've set up a brand new technical committee, CV301, which we'll hear a little bit more about in a little while. And of course, this new ISO subcommittee that was proposed and set up by the Chinese standards organization. The Americans are also very close to that work, and we'll be hearing about that a little bit later too. And obviously, really important for us is working with stakeholders to help progress and deliver change and increase take-up of work in this area. And certainly we've been closely working with Build Offsite, and more increasingly, perhaps more recently, with Offsite Alliance as well. And obviously connecting to the Construction Innovation Hub and that important work that they've been doing for the last 4 years on the platform and other areas. And we'll be hearing a bit more about that as well later on. All right, so let's move on now, and I'll introduce the first speaker. I'm very pleased to introduce Mark Farmer, CEO and founding director of CAST Consultancy. He has over 30 years experience in construction and real estate, and is a well-recognized international commentator on a variety of industry and policy related issues. He authored the really quite famous now Farmer Review, Modernise or Die. Following that, in 2019, he was appointed as the government's champion for modern methods of construction in house building. He's a member of the Construction Leadership Council, Senior Advisors Group, a national co-chair of Constructing Excellence, technical advisor to Homes England, and chair of the West Midlands Combined Authority Future Homes Task Force. And he's a trustee of the Moby Educational Charity. Mark's also an honorary professor at the University of Salford, School of Built Environment, and holds an honorary doctorate from the University College of Estate Management and the University of Wolverhampton. So over to you, Mark. Thank you all. Thanks.
Thank you, Claire, and good afternoon, everyone. I am going to attempt over the next 15-20 minutes or so perhaps to do a bit of scene setting for the rest of this session. So you're going to hear various elements around the journey towards standards and technical assurance and accreditation, and I think it probably is worth just reflecting on why we keep talking about offsite construction, offsite manufacturing, pre-manufacturing, modern methods of construction, whatever you want to term it. And there's plenty of buzzwords and acronyms for pretty much the same thing, which is effectively changing how we do things in the industry. And I just wanted to spend a bit of time just reinforcing the context of why this is so important. And I am firmly of the opinion that we have challenges in front of us that we haven't seen before as an industry. I've said that a lot, and it's a debate as to whether industry is listening to that, recognises the severity of the issues, but certainly we have some pretty unprecedented challenges. So I'm just going to attempt to advance my slide deck. Just bear with me a second. Andrew, can you do it for me? Doesn't seem to be working. So let me start with some of that sort of background context. So look, the last 12 months, as I've just said, we have an unprecedented position in terms of geopolitics, in terms of general international economics, the UK domestic scene, and overlay on that. There's so much that's happened in this last 12-month period. It's often difficult to take it all in. So we're still dealing with some of the fallout from Brexit, and not all of that has made itself apparent yet, but some of that is starting to really show itself in terms of complexity around trade and friction at borders. Clearly, we thought we were coming out of one of the biggest shocks in recent times around a pandemic, and hoping that that would set the scene for economic recovery. But post-pandemic, we've now entered a world where not only do we have a major conflict in Europe, in Ukraine, which has been a huge further shock beyond the pandemic in terms of global supply chains. It's obviously created an energy crisis and had a broader economic fallout across the world. On top of that, we've had some very homegrown issues in terms of political turmoil. So in the space of 2022, we've had 2 prime ministers, or 3 now actually, so we've had 2 changes of prime minister, pretty unprecedented. That has impacted general confidence as well. So there's no 2 ways about it, but all of that is a pretty heady cocktail of things that not just the construction industry, but the wider UK economy and industrial sectors as a whole has to face. Next slide. And clearly what's happened even in the last 6 to 8 weeks, you can say has set a play that we're now having to unpick in the immediate future. So in the wake of the Truss government, which was pretty short-lived, but actually was high impact, and now with the clear direction set by the mini budget in the last couple of weeks, we are entering some economic headwinds. And that will have direct impacts on the construction sector, on the property and real estate sector. Indeed, it already is. But what I would say is that from an offsite construction and modernisation perspective, the stakes are very high, because if we are facing into a slowdown in activity, which I think we are going to be certainly in 2023, then there is a real choice for many businesses to make in terms of whether they seize the initiative and look to future-proof themselves, or whether they retrench. They see economic fragility as being an excuse to bunker down, if you like, and actually avoid making those decisions that perhaps they should have done before, but actually think they can wait until we get into economic recovery mode. Next slide. So just a bit of reflection on what's been going on around policy and trying to influence the construction and house building industry, certainly over the last 6-7 years, and the time I've been involved in advising the government and helping to shape policy. There's a lot that has happened, and this timeline indicates that in no uncertain terms. Lots of reports, lots of different policy initiatives, lots of interventions into the whole world of construction, both from a public sector perspective and also trying to influence the private sector to change the way it does things. Increasingly, the advent of regional economies, devolution, a sort of post-industrial strategy, spread of policy influence, not just from Whitehall, but into combined authorities and mayoral authorities has been a feature of that. But there's not one thing I would suggest that over that period that you can point to and say that's had a seismic impact on defining or shifting how we go about doing construction, how we brief, how we design, how we procure, how we build. Unfortunately, nothing has had that knockout blow, and that is the nature of the beast. I think most governments are nervous about intervening into markets, and clearly that has played out here. There's probably a couple of things I would point to as being pretty significant evolutions from a MMC and policy perspective. One was the presumption in favour of MMC for government departments back in 2018, I think it was, in the budget, where the big spending government departments, DFE, MOJ, DHSC and MOD now have to default to a MMC use position on new capex unless they can prove why they shouldn't. Now, the reality is that the way in which that's landed in the market has been pretty erratic. It hasn't been a uniform and overnight move towards building in a different way, but it certainly set a direction around public procurers in central government that they have to really consider MMC. Similarly, in the house building sector, Homes England, in their latest 2021 to 26 affordable homes programme, have set some clear MMC requirements for the distribution of their investment programme, and that's certainly started to stimulate interest and demand in MMC from housing associations and local authorities. So good progress, but nothing that's really tipped us over the edge into recognising that this is the way we have to do things at scale. Next slide, please. So with all the things I've outlined, whether it's Brexit, whether it's the pandemic, whether it's the war in Ukraine, all of these things are really have served to amplify issues that I would suggest are not new. They're all things that we already knew in terms of lack of resiliency in our industry. We've had huge issues with inflation, driven by erratic supply chains and resource scarcity. We have big issues with labour inflation driven by lack of resources, and I'll come back to that in a second. All of this is not new. All we've had is an amplification, if you like, of those issues that have been in existence for a long time. Next slide, please. One of the reasons, if I just dwell on the labour issue, because I think it is so important in this whole debate as to why offsite has to be the way forward for our industry. This is a graph that's quite telling. It's a long run graphic showing the level of construction employment in the UK going back 40 odd years. You see there the usual peaks and troughs of economic cycles, and importantly, over each economic peak, they've been gradually getting bigger from the late 70s through to the late 80s, through to the boom pre-global financial crisis in 2008, 2009. Each of those peaks got bigger and bigger. What's telling is that last peak, which is just before COVID in 2019, did not get to the peak, or did not get bigger than the previous peak. It actually reduced, it peaked out at less than the previous peak employment position. Now, that might not mean much to many people, but for me, it's really, really telling that what I've been unable to do in the last economic cycle is reinflate our workforce to a level it was before, or indeed beat it, which is what we've done in every other economic cycle, as a function, if nothing else, of population growth. So the actual total number of employed people in the industry is usually tracked to population growth, which has grown significantly in the last 10 to 15 years, and we haven't seen that. We're now seeing real growing pains every time we look to grow our industry and our output. We have issues, and you can see it here. This is an amplification of that last bit of that graph. So looking back, from the peak just before the global financial crisis at 2.58 million employed in 2008, pre-COVID that hit 2.43. As of the last month or two, we're now down to 2.16 million people. So that should be a real wake-up call. We've lost 16% of our workforce in the last 15 to 16 years. And that's at a time when the UK's population has grown by the order of 5 million people. So as a resource base, we have less people that is required to do more in terms of building homes, schools, hospitals, all the other infrastructure we need. Next slide, please. Some of this is being driven by demographics, some of it's being driven by free labour markets or lack of free labour markets post-Brexit. So what we have is a conspiring of issues between the fact that the older part of our workforce, which is UK domestic, is retiring. It's not being replenished in equal measure by a UK domestic younger demographic. The younger demographic over the last decade has primarily been migrant labour. That resource has now been pretty much turned off, and through Brexit and Ukraine. So we're now seeing a gradual ageing of the workforce, eroding the structural base of our industry. Next slide, please. And just to make the point that this is not a UK specific issue. So even though the UK has some very unique situations, particularly around Brexit, this is certainly the demographic issues that Western and developed economies are experiencing are generic. So this is the US's equivalent graph of what I've just shown you, exactly the same position where the US construction workforce was unable to reach the previous peak it achieved pre-global financial crisis. Next slide, please. So with all of that, you would think that the construction industry would sit up, listen, start thinking about how it does things. Unfortunately, that has not been the case, certainly not universally. There's definitely been progress, and I'll come on to that in a second. But I think there's a sense that actually, notwithstanding all of those problems and all those external events, that it's very difficult for the industry to self-start and to change from within. It needs leadership, it needs a sense of collective change and ambition. It needs to be instigated from the right parts of the industry, particularly around the need for clients and advisors to asked the industry to do things differently, which has been an ongoing issue. So all of this, for whatever reason, even with all of those problems, has not been sufficient of a stimulus for the industry to wholesale move to a different way of doing things. Next slide, please. COVID was an interesting period of transition in some respects for the industry, because what happened during 2020 and 21, particularly in 2020 when we first had the onset of the pandemic, is that the industry came to a grinding halt for a short period of time. Then it got going again in socially distanced conditions, and all of the anecdotal evidence I've heard talking to senior representatives of contractors is that actually individual team site productivity went up during COVID. And it's undoubtedly linked to the fact that social distancing drove more structure and order to how production was being planned on building sites. So the fact that you had less labour, but it was more organised, it had to be spread out more, there was less risk of damaging each other's work, trades falling all over each other, actually led to a net productivity uplift at a team level, albeit in many instances total output reduced because there was less labour. What's happened since, unfortunately, and this hasn't been borne out in official statistics, but I'm hearing it anecdotally, is that we've had a big fall away in productivity since the pandemic ended in the last 10 months or so. I'm hearing that productivity on construction sites, productivity even in professional services is down. And that does not bode well against the backdrop of all of the issues around labour supply that I just outlined. Next slide, please. And I think one of the key issues to think about here, particularly if we're going into a new economic cycle, is that we have a public sector ability to fund the industry and to actually ensure that the construction industry has stimulus for growth in an economic downturn, which is under pressure. So the ability for the government, with everything that's gone on over the last year or two, bailing out from the energy crisis, the pandemic, there is no big pot of money that's going to fund a massive infrastructure program. But there's already commitments made to infrastructure, but as these headlines suggest, a lot of that's under pressure already in terms of affordability. So some of this is down to productivity and competence and lack of ability to deliver to predictable results, actually having an impact on the government's confidence to use the construction industry as well. Next slide, please. And in the background of all of this, it goes without saying that we continue to attempt to address the climate change issue. It's not going away, albeit there was a bit of a wobble earlier this year through the political volatility that we saw as to whether there would be continued commitment to net zero. That has borne out, and I think that's the right thing. Certainly for the industry, it's going to prove to be a major change agent, but it does need long-term commitment. It needs the government to be very clear on how it's going to define net zero and how it drives that into the built environment through regulation, how investors are going to drive it through ESG patterns of funding and as well. And that's a really important element of change that I think hasn't really started to come to the fore yet, but it will over the next 5 to 10 years. Next slide, please. And I think it's also really important to recognise the MMC debate is not a binary debate. It really amazes me how much I hear a discussion about whether a job is an MMC job or a traditional job. That's a fairly rare bookending of the situation. What in reality is happening is that across the 7 defined categories, and certainly in home building, we've defined MMC quite specifically now in 7 categories, covering all the different techniques and methods that you will find. It's all about proportions. This is not whether a job is an MMC job, because actually I would say 60 to 70% of all construction in this country has some form of MMC being used in it. So when you hear statistics saying that there's only about 10% of jobs with MMC in it, they're all wrong. I can assure you that now, because they're not measuring the right thing. We should be measuring the proportions of what is being built in this country in terms of labour, plant, material, process, supervision, temporary works. That's the only way we measure progress holistically, because there's all different types of MMC being deployed already. Next slide, please. And at a macro level, this is what it boils down to. It's actually trying to adjust an equation, which is at the moment 60% type process orientated for most home building construction, certainly, and actually rebalance resources. So that requires less labour on site, less process on site, and going from 40% of pre-manufactured value, which is the material inanimate content, next slide, moving that to 55%. So that moving that dial is the objective here. That's the policy objective of government. That has to be the objective of industry, to actually enable us to do more with less human capital. Because for the reasons I've already set out, we have less and less human resources to be able to achieve the same level of output. Next slide, please. So just sort of bringing this to a conclusion around where we're at, what I would say is that this is a dangerous time for MMC, and I say that in guardedly, because I sense that there's all the reasons for change are there for the reasons I've just outlined to you all, but there's also lots of nervousness. All of these headlines here show you that actually moving to a different model of delivery is not easy. It's not without risk. There is a big reliance on actually innovating responsibly, innovating with the right business model, understanding how you deliver things sustainably, and not just going with a mad fad and that's something that comes and goes, which unfortunately we've seen before with the move to MMC. And all of these headlines suggest, particularly in the volumetric modular world, category 1 modular MMC, there are some issues in terms of getting a viable business model, and that cannot be ignored. And that is why when you're moving towards a different way of delivery, you have to have a business model-led approach. You have to have demand, you have to have clients, you have to understand how you're going to create a sustainable business. Next slide. But what we're also seeing, conversely to that, is a recognition in big areas of the industry, particularly in main contracting, tier 1 main contracting, and in house building, that actually, for all the reasons I've said about labour supply, if nothing else, they're all having to think about a change to their model. And these headlines show you that actually, against all of that negativity in the previous slide, there's opportunism now showing itself around businesses being acquired for medium-term business plan restructuring, vertically integrating manufacturing capacity of different types, whether it's panelized, modular volumetric, sub-assemblies. You're seeing house builders and contractors starting to bring that capability in-house, which is quite telling. It's what I would term a Darwinian evolution of the markets. They all wake up to a world where there's less labour. Next slide, please. And it's also quite clear that there's big parts of the MMC supply chain that have been very successful. So again, set against some of the negative headlines, there is a lot of activity that's happened over the last few years in terms of different parts across the category spectrum that I outlined to you, where there's lots of innovation happening, lots of R&D, lots of investment, and there's full order books. So don't get taken in by stories about Legal & General or Ilka having empty factories. The reality is that's part of a planned business model, and the reality is the wider MMC and move towards pre-manufacturing debate, there's already some healthy businesses out there driving change. Next slide, please. Just to sort of bring this back to BSI and the order of the day in terms of standards, we can't do any of that unless we have a fit for purpose standards and accreditation and assessment regime. So there's very much need for all the things that BSI stand for and that Claire is going through in her introductory comments. We need to work out what is required for the offsite sector. What is there at the moment still doesn't work. It is not uniform enough, it's not unified enough, it doesn't create enough confidence that in certain parts of the funding and insurance fraternity, we need to do more. A lot of work has been done over the previous few years, and you can see some logos there of businesses and platforms that have been really, really important in doing that. We have to take the warranty businesses with us, certainly in house building. We have to have a uniform set of standards that work, particularly if building regulations and approved documents don't always work for some forms of innovative construction. So a big issue there around trying to drive standards, which I know BSI is right in the heart of. Next slide, please. And on a related matter, if we know what standards are that we're building to, we need to have the skills to deliver. So if we've got less people, of the people we've got, we need them trained to deliver differently. And that's why skills plan for the industry, both for traditional skills and for new and modern skills and hybrid skills, is so important in making sure this all happens. Next slide, please. And ultimately, a big decision to be made by government, something that's been very much looked for in the last 2 to 3 weeks. Actually, you would have seen lots of headlines about the pressure from business to relent on migrant worker access, particularly post-Brexit, to allow visas for priority trades and occupations. Lots of toing and froing. It would appear that on both sides of the house at the moment, the move is to actually really force industry to take the pain and to actually train and skill up from its domestic workforce, not to rely on cheap and immediate sources of labour. That's going to be painful. It's probably the right medicine required, though, to drive the industry towards a different place around that training regime. Next slide, please. And finally, the debate in front of us, I suppose, is, well, where is the MMC market going to be in a year's time, in 5 years' time? I think there's an inevitability for the reasons I've discussed that we will change. We have to change. From a political perspective, the current Prime Minister, when he was Chancellor, has some very direct experience of the importance of MMC. My dealings with government are not just in DLUC, but actually in other parts of government. I know there are lots of supporters of MMC and the move to modernising how we build homes and schools and hospitals across government, whether that's Stephen Barclay, now at DHSC, or the likes of Richard Bacon, who did the Bacon Review on customer self-build. There are lots of people there actively trying to influence how the industry moves forward. So I'm positive that we're going to continue to see the right stimuli from government, but ultimately the industry needs to also grab this and run with it and drive change. So thank you for listening. Hopefully that will set some context for the ongoing discussions that you're going to have as part of this session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. That was really excellent and a great deal to think about there. Yes, lots of difficulties are apparent, but also some positives. But the imperative is there. We absolutely have to do it. So I think that message came across loud and clear. All right, so let's move on to the next session. I'd like to introduce Matthew Egan. He's CEO of Modularize and the chair of our new technical committee, CB 301 for offsite construction. Over to you, Matthew.
Thanks, Claire. Let me just make sure I can click through. Yeah. Hi everyone. Apologies if there's a little bit of an echo or if it's not too inconvenient. I'm just in quite an echoey office today. My name is Matthew Egan. I am a chair of CB 301, Modern Methods of Construction new committee that Claire mentioned. An accolade I like to claim is that I was one of the first people in the world to graduate with an MSc specifically in the field of off-site construction, which was advanced manufacturing for construction from the University of Salford. And on the back of that, I set up my company Modularize in 2011. So Modularize was set up to bridge the gap between manufacturing and architecture, basically. Being from a kind of manufacturing background myself, and creeping into a modular construction company and kind of learning from the nuts and bolts up how everything worked. I kind of fell in love with it. Modularize really basically develops products for the offsite construction sector. In recent years, we started to launch kind of a few different products and companies into the sector. One of those is ModNet, which is a kind of a standardized approach to modular housing. And just picking up on a few of the things that Mark raised in his presentation, in the terms of kind of like urban splash or the module manufacturers that might have gone bust in the past for whatever reason that might be. What generally happens is the product or the technology that they've got is very bespoke to that manufacturer. So when that manufacturer disappears, unfortunately, the know-how and the capability to produce that product disappears. So, you know, if we can start to standardize, if we can start to kind of leverage economies of scale across standard components and standard assemblies within the industry, then we'll start to kind of mitigate what I refer to as kind of eggs in one basket risk, where a module manufacturer or product manufacturer disappears and all of that technology goes. So I think we're starting to see that a little bit more in the industry, and we'll certainly, you know, committees like CB301 and Platform Rulebook, construction innovation hub, all of this stuff will help to kind of start to kind of standardize and mitigate all of those kind of risks that we've seen in the past. I won't talk too much about the ISO International Committee, which is a mirror of the National CB301 Committee, because I know Ryan, the next speaker, has got quite a lot to say on international standards and what's happening around the world, and we'll talk a little bit about this. I would just say that when we had the first meeting in June, I thought it was really interesting, the range of international you know, committees that were present and were contributing to the development of the standard internationally. I thought that you know, Ryan was there from the American standards as well, and I think certainly between the UK and the USA, I thought we were kind of forward thinking, and there's a door to push on there so that we can kind of you know, if we got our own house in shape, which is the purpose of CB301 in my view, then we can kind of start to echo that and reflect that internationally as well. The committee membership, just to give you an idea, there's a lot of private companies, there's a lot of individual kind of members in there as well, but there's a good cross section of industry bodies like Offsite Alliance, Build Offsite, and insurance companies like NHBC. The bit where I think we're probably falling a little bit short on in terms of a constitution of the committee, and I'd like to see some development or some further membership in this area is regarding developers and main contractors. So getting that front end view of what's going on early on in a project, what those kind of drivers are, and what's important to developers and main contractors would be really useful. We don't really have that in the committee yet, so it's something I'm kind of quite conscious to kind of build in. Journey so far, so excuse me, we kind of started trying to think about what we'd need in terms of standards for the UK, and building on some of the research BSI's already done and Claire pointed out earlier. Oh, sorry, I'll go back. Building on some of that research that BSI have done, and obviously the experience of the committee members, we kind of started on the kind of front foot of developing what we call taxonomy or terminology. So we wanted to create a standard that would kind of standardize terminology. And as we kind of kicked that around a bit more between individual kind of group meetings and talked about what that might look like, it kind of became apparent that we don't really have a method for standardizing how we describe offsite systems. So when we kind of design offsite, we design construction projects, we get to a point where inevitably we start to do feasibility, and within feasibility we want to compare different products, understand how different products interface together within that particular construction project. And at the moment it's kind of difficult to do that. There's no kind of single source of truth where you can kind of compare a document of a particular system, modular system, panelized system, pod system with another one, and kind of understand the differences, understand what the interfaces are with other systems or with even traditional systems. So what we've kind of agreed as a group is to focus our efforts initially on trying to get a business case together where we could produce a standard that would effectively allow the production of standardized specification documents for MMC or offsite systems. And alongside that, what we'd like to do is see another standard that would allow us to describe a process by which MMC systems or offsite systems can be selected effectively. So things kind of like building on the RIBA span of work, the value toolkit, whereby, you know, effectively we want to get offsite construction systems specified correctly at the correct stage of a project and use a standard reference point in terms of the different systems that are out there. So, you know, if you can imagine modular systems, they can consist of steel frames. Even within a steel frame modular system, you can have a point loaded system or a line loaded system. Modular systems can also be CLT or timber frame. So just within the single sphere of the category 1 type modular systems, you know, you've got all of these different kind of parameters to consider when you're optioneering, and there's just no kind of standardized document that you can kind of compare apples for apples with. So that's what we're hoping to kind of put a business case together for in terms of creating the first standard. Next steps, what we hope to do is like I say, create that business case. Now all of this is quite new for me. I've not been on any committees for BSI, and this is my first committee on, and I'm actually chairing it. So it's all quite new. I'm kind of learning as I go along, if I'm honest. But it's really exciting to be able to take part in something that, you know, I believe is going to be really beneficial for the industry. And the group of committee members that we've got is just fantastic. So it's a real privilege to kind of be chairing it, and I'm excited to see where it's going to go. So like I say, our kind of journey that we're on is now that we think we've got a scope together, we're going to develop a pipeline of work to refine that scope alongside with developing the business case. And while we're doing that, if you kind of remember at the start what I said about the ISO committee, so we are a mirror committee of the ISO committee. That's why we were set up. But what does that mean? For me, that means there's an opportunity for us to actually, you know, influence those ISO standards more. And we can't influence those ISO standards unless we've got our own set of standards. So in understanding what standards we need to generate to be able to influence our own national policies and the way businesses work, there's a real opportunity to get that right and then kind of reflect that into national level as well. So we'll continue to advise. There's actually myself, Ryan, who's the next speaker, and another committee member from the national group are on the chairman's advisory group for the ISO committee as well. So we'll continue to advise on that as well, and hopefully we'll start to see some good things coming out from CB301. So thank you.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Matthew. That was really good, and yeah, it is really early days with a brand new committee and new chair. And so it's great to hear some first impressions, and also how you know, just how you start to think about a new portfolio of standards and where to start. I think that would be quite interesting to explore a bit more. So we'll have some questions for Matthew along with Ryan after Ryan's talk. So let me introduce Ryan now. He is Vice President Innovation at the International Code Council in the USA, where he leads the Energy Resilience and Innovation Center of Focus. He also served as Executive Director of the Alliance for National and Community Resilience, ANCR, a national coalition working to provide communities with the tools necessary to holistically assess and improve their resilience. Prior to joining ICC, he served as Vice President at the National Institute of Building Sciences, where he directed the Consultative Council and served as Staff Director of the Council on Finance, Insurance and Real Estate, the National Council on Building Codes and Standards, the Offsite Construction Council and the Institute's STEM education programme. Ryan is the editor of the book Optimizing Community Infrastructure, Resilience in the Face of Shocks and Stresses. Previously he served as Manager of Government Affairs for ASHRAE and Programme Director for the Renewable and Natural Resources Foundation. He graduated from the George Washington University Law School and holds a BA with honours in Environmental Policy from the University of Florida. Thanks, Ryan. Over to you.
Great, thanks so much, and really appreciate the opportunity to be with you today to share a little bit on sort of the global activities around offsite construction. But first, let me give you sort of a quick snapshot of the International Code Council and particularly, why we're interested in offsite construction and a lot of these issues generally. So as Claire mentioned, ICC is based in the US, but we do work globally through the development of model building codes and standards and a lot of the support tools that really make them effective. And so, sort of with the broad background of advancing safety, sustainability, and resilience in buildings and communities, offsite or MMC certainly fits very well, within that perspective. While I will be providing, sort of the international perspective, I will say that, many of the issues and sort of challenges that both Mark and Matthew mentioned from a UK perspective are also very much, happening in the US, particularly around labor, productivity, issues around affordability and availability of housing, those sorts of challenges. And again, offsite construction is certainly seen as a mechanism to help address many of those challenges. So from here on out, I'm going to sort of share sort of the things that are going on from an international perspective, particularly through the lens of the ISO TC59 Subcommittee 19, which I'll sort of introduce a little bit more in a second. But these were sort of the four main drivers that sort of were the basis for consideration of formation, of the subcommittee. And so, these are not new. Certainly solving the housing crisis, looking at, sort of generally the long period of time it takes to, construct a building, figuring out sort of opportunities to shorten that, which then means, time savings, speed to market, all of those sorts of things, potential for cost savings. I would also add, sort of additional to cost savings is, sustainability. In a factory setting, you can certainly be more deliberate about the materials you use, less waste, all of those things. And then, the productivity that comes with, factory setting as well. And then just the sort of construction process itself. In a factory, you don't need to deal with weather, seasonal changes, spoilage. You can also think about sort of the opportunities that it opens up, for a workforce that is beyond maybe sort of what the traditional construction, workforce looks like. In a factory, you can have, sort of all of the assistive technologies. You sort of climb a 6-foot ladder, and that's about all you need to do. Rather than sort of being on a job site which has sort of inherent safety issues as well. Additionally, this is a sort of phenomenon or sort of interest globally is picking up significantly. So this is the projected growth in offsite construction, through 2023, and you see, in the U.S. it's a 7.5%. In the Middle East, it's 6%, Japan, China, even up to 9%. So really, seeing interest and growth, around the world to advance offsite construction. I think the other piece, really recognizing where, sort of site-built construction, it may be, specifically localized. There are, huge opportunities in the offsite construction space for sort of expansion globally, and sort of more and more finished products sort of moving through the supply chain. So just a little bit of background on sort of ISO. ISO is really a consortium or a sort of gathering of national standard bodies from around the world. So BSI, for instance, in the UK, develops standards, within the context of the UK, and then there are 166 other national bodies that come together to really identify where are there opportunities for collaboration, how can we share best practices, those sorts of things. And so ISO has about 25,000 standards that they develop through 809 technical committees. Just for a little bit of background, in the US, the American National Standards Institute is the representative to ISO, and ANSI really relies on standard development organizations in the US to be sort of the technical experts and participants in the ISO process. So one of those 809 technical committees is ISO TC 59, which covers buildings and civil engineering works, which is obviously a very broad category of activities. Much of the work of TC 59 happens in subcommittees. So recently, actually just this past summer, Subcommittee 19 on prefabricated buildings was formed with 12 participating members and 9 observing members. We'll talk about that in a minute. We'll also talk about the scope of that committee, but really, because of the sort of initial formation just this summer, very much in sort of the starting stages, and we'll talk about sort of what that pathway is moving forward. So here are the participating standards bodies within SC19. China is the chair. The countries in blue are participating members, so very active in the process, voting in the outcomes of the activities from the subcommittee. And then there are 9 observing members who are interested in the topic but maybe don't have the level of expertise or the level of interest to sort of be the participating members. There is a chair's advisory group, initially, of course, led by China, but also representatives from the US, France, and UK participating in that advisory group. We may have a few more participants in that group. But really being, sort of the eyes and ears of, sort of what's going on, where there are opportunities for the subcommittee to, work on standards or other sort of resources to help advance the offsite construction space. So here is the scope that was agreed on, based off of the initial discussion within the sort of interested parties to Subcommittee 19, and then ultimately rolling up to the TC 59 group as a whole to approve. Certainly not going to read through these, but I think there are certainly some key areas that the subcommittee will focus on. We already heard about the importance of terminology and metrics, and so that will certainly be a key part of the discussion. A taxonomy around sort of the various different types of offsite construction. Looking at the entire process from planning, design, and production will be incredibly important. Really being able to unlock the value that offsite construction provides. So certainly could see some activity in that space. Huge opportunities to leverage building information modeling and other sort of digital processes within the offsite construction space. So certainly looking at the intersections with those types of activities. Documentation and the construction installation process is certainly important for offsite. And then the verification process. Offsite construction, if done in a factory, is a very different type of process than I think most sort of inspectors or regulatory processes are familiar with from a site built perspective. On a site built project, an inspector can show up every day if they want and really see what's going on. But if you get into sort of more and more finished more closed construction that shows up at the job site, that role of the local inspector versus factory inspection, changes. And so being able to sort of recognize, those changes is essential. Because of, sort of the broad scope of activities that ISO covers, there are sort of some elements that are covered within, different technical committees or different subcommittees. And so there's always this list of sort of exclusions of, what the subcommittee is not going to cover. And so, sort of navigating, those boundaries is important. And so they just sort of document, these exclusions for that benefit. So one of the first steps that the committee, and actually even in the formation of the committee subcommittee process, is reviewing sort of what existing standards are out there. So naturally looking at existing ISO standards that help support offsite construction, looking at SEN standards, and then looking at national standards that have been developed. The pictures here are actually two standards that ICC developed, 1200 on the construction planning, design, fabrication, and assembly side of the process, 1205 on the inspection and regulatory compliance side. And so being able to feed those into sort of the ISO process, really understanding sort of where standards do exist, where the best practice is captured, where are there opportunities to potentially harmonize to really get the benefits of an international standard system. And so already we've compiled the list of relevant standards from Germany, France, Japan, China, US. There are, I know, Canadian standards. I know the Standards Australia's doing work in this space. And so really being able to see how we can harmonize and where we can harmonize to really help drive progress. So these are sort of the recommended actions, primarily developed through the chair of SC19, not really vetted through the subcommittee yet, but really sort of lay out some of the opportunities, needs, and challenges around a variety of different things in the offsite construction space. So certainly looking at the production process itself, supply chain, meeting some of the sort of things that we would normally see within a building code, assuring that the structure, the connections, all of those pieces are adequate to meet the requirements. Certainly tolerances, particularly if you're moving towards higher and higher degrees of finish, become increasingly important. Transport, again, a very important piece of the process. I mentioned the inspection and verification piece, and then maintenance and upkeeping. Certainly could be some very different types of maintenance requirements, for offsite constructed projects rather than sort of site built. So here is sort of the timeline of activities, really towards developing a comprehensive work program, identifying standard needs, standard activities. We're just at the very sort of early stages of this process, really setting up a working group to look at terminology, which really should set the basis for many of the other sort of standards activities that flow from there. Moving from sort of the terminology, we'll look at sort of the specific standards needs, and then sort of working through that process. As Matthew mentioned, certainly having the important participation from key countries and standards developers that are working in this space is really important to assure both sort of our sort of domestic sort of needs are addressed, that the standards that are developed in this space sort of recognize existing standards and sort of how things work best together. I think the one thing to note about the ISO process, it is very deliberative. So I think we'll see sort of things come out in fits and starts. I expect our next meeting will be in 2023 at some point. So with that, hopefully that provides a sort of a quick snapshot of some of the international perspectives and international activities in this space, and certainly look forward to answering any questions folks may have.
Great, thank you very much, Ryan. And if Matthew, you'd like to put your camera on as well, we can do some questions. So do please send in any questions that you may have. I just want to do a quick pickup first, though. So Matthew, you were saying that you're a bit short of people from the manufacturing side of offsite construction on the committee. I think it's perhaps worth saying there's a lot of information on membership of committees on the bsigroup.com website, how to express an interest and how to get involved. It is really important that that we have as wide a representation as possible on all of our committees. So please do. We had some initial impressions from Matthew about participation in the committees. Yeah, so please do look into that. So all right, so we've had a couple of questions come through. Is there a role for digital technologies for the site assembly stages for modular and volumetric components? That's David Morrissey. Anyone want to pick that up? Matthew, do you want to have a go at that one?
Yeah, certainly. As we kind of increase the uptake of building information modeling or digital twins, the more information we can put into the as-built asset, the better, really, and that kind of extends all the way through from what goes through the manufacturing facility right the way through to tracking of where the modules or various different bits of the building are around the country as they're going to get delivered to site, and kind of what kind of what module goes where in the assembly process. There's just massive scope for it. I know Ryan's done a bit of that with MBI, I think, in terms of badging up modules and checking where they're going, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge opportunity. A lot of sort of tracking modules at this point is based off of sort of labels that are stuck on the side of it that sort of verify it's gone through an inspection process, what code it's met. But certainly opportunities to track that more. And I think particularly as we look at sort of an expansion in sort of internationally provided offsite modules, that becomes increasingly important. I mean, we're seeing in the US, modules come from Eastern Europe, China, into the US, and so being able to track that effectively, I think is really essential as well. The other piece I'll add in it is the potential for remote virtual inspection. So being able to sort of monitor factories remotely, I think is another sort of digital tool that could be really helpful, throughout the process.
Thank you. Talking about the construction industry being heavily regulated already, is standards and more standards the right approach? I mean, I suppose this is a BSI standards event, so standards are generally considered to be good things, beneficial. But I suppose really the crux of the question is about new standards, or do we really need to look at what exists already on the sort of traditional build side and think about adapting those documents for MMC? Is that going to be a better way forward?
So I can give you sort of where we got to, relative to the development of standards. So, in the U.S. and I would assume, most places, no matter whether you construct the building using offsite construction or site-built construction, it needs to comply with the requirements that are in the building code. So things that provide, safety, resilience, all of those pieces. The challenge is, many of those codes were not written from the perspective of, factory built and offsite construction. And so the challenge is, you can't sort of neatly fit an offsite construction process or neatly demonstrate that an offsite construction process meets those code requirements. And so the standards that we developed sort of came from that basis of, meeting the baseline code requirements, but providing a pathway for offsite construction to demonstrate compliance in a way that's meaningful and consistent. So the standards that we've developed look at sort of that demonstration of compliance. So that documentation, the quality assurance process in the factory, the third party and inspection procedures in the factory to assure that at the end of the day, you're getting the same level of safety and efficiency and resilience, but actually enabling the offsite construction industry to do that in a much more streamlined process and deal with some of the challenges and maybe unfamiliarity of the regulatory landscape, sort of with those processes. So we saw it really as an enabler and enhancing the ability of offsite construction to really address a lot of the challenges that we've identified as a need.
And something that came up in the research that we did was this need for on-site inspection for the traditional side, but surely it's more factory inspection for the off-site side. Matthew, did you want to comment on that question?
No, well, maybe just to give kind of a bit of a real-world example of where there might be a gap from an existing standard to a potentially new modern methods of construction standards. So, transporting chunks of a building around, you present all of these manufacturing kind of issues and things you have to work through, but then you've got the transient state of the building. So there's nothing really out there that looks at how we kind of maintain quality in the transient state of the building. So how long should a module realistically be left outside in the rain before wrapped in a protective wrap before it starts to get condensation or mold in there? There's nothing that's kind of finger in the air at the moment, and there's UV degradation of breathable membranes on the outside of buildings because it's left in the transient state. So there are gaps, I think, from what we've got in more generic or traditional standards, and I think that's where we're gonna be able to pick off where those gaps are. And the difficulty is how you kind of do that with a broad brush approach across so many different types of MMC building systems.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, isn't it? I mean, we have all the BS 8000 standards, which are workmanship, but it's workmanship and delivery and storage, storage. So perhaps there's something in that area. Okay, so next one is what development is being undertaken to change the thought process of procurement of construction projects? The major failing of MMC companies is MMC requires large reserves of cash to start the project. Procurement and contract mechanisms and clauses need to, hang on, where is it? Oh, sorry. Yes, this is one for you actually, Ryan. The approach looks great in terms of considering the life cycle perspective. Given the drive for net zero and the role that construction plays in that, and the increasing prominence of refurbishment and retrofit over demolition, should there be a focus on through life and beyond first use of prefabricated components? This might include disassembly and reuse as well as adaptation.
Yeah, so definitely a great question and a great opportunity. I'll mention a couple things. One specifically in the offsite space. So we are actually developing a third standard on mechanical, electrical, plumbing systems, energy efficiency, and water conservation in offsite construction, really seeing, sort of where are the opportunities for advancement, in the factory, around those sorts of things. I think there are certainly opportunities, around deconstruction and reuse. We're also looking at sort of opportunities to use offsite construction for energy efficiency retrofits, much like Energy Sprung in Germany and the Netherlands. So that's certainly an opportunity as well. One other sort of more broad activity that we're working on relative to the building space in general is actually creation of a standard for the measurement and verification of whole life carbon. So really looking at all stages of the construction life cycle, from design, construction, operations, and deconstruction, to be able to effectively capture sort of what impact each of those processes have on the carbon emissions associated with buildings. And we've really recognized the opportunity that offsite construction plays in reducing waste and being able to more effectively use materials. We've certainly seen I guess you could call them one-off or sort of anecdotal studies on some of that impact. Some claiming it up to 45% reduction in emissions associated with offsite. Be great to have a much more sort of broader focused survey or study to be able to sort of really make that claim. But sort of on paper, it looks like there's definitely huge opportunities in that space.
Did you have any comments there?
It all generates a lot of data, doesn't it? A lot of data, and there's a lot of different ways of collating. Like you said that there's anecdotal information at most at present, so perhaps standards could kind of lean on that issue a little bit as well.
Okay. And one final one for you, actually, just going back to this one, it was quite a long question, which is why I sort of lost track of it, but I think ultimately it's around procurement and contract mechanisms and the clauses needed to evolve with the sensitivities that MMC are exposed to during daily operations. So different needs really, and whether there's a need to address that.
Yeah, I think definitely on procurement, that's kind of when I was trying to describe earlier what the two new standards there were that we've been kind of kicking around the committee. The first part is to standardize how we describe these systems, so that when we're making those procurement decisions early on at the feasibility stage, we can compare consistent bits of information and understand what's best where. The next part of that is then ensuring that happens at the right stage in the process. So at our IBA stage 0, and not later on in stage 3 or 4 after something's got planning. So the other part of the standard we'd like to introduce is kind of building on the value toolkit and the BSI Flex. I can't remember the number of it now, but there's one that basically has come out with the value toolkit, which kind of leans on value-based decisions in procurement rather than go into the cheapest solution. And as we kind of lean on those value-based procurement decisions, inevitably offsite and MMC systems should come out trumps. That then, as you kind of move away from the traditional procurement process, does present questions in terms of how you organize it contractually. And it's kind of out of my sphere of expertise, but I know there's a lot going on in terms of collaborative form of contract and how that can kind of help and work back on the MMC bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there is a standard on collaborative relationships actually built environment. Perhaps you can check that one out too. All right, well, I'll draw that Q&A to a close. Thank you both so much. They were really interesting talks, and thanks very much for answering those questions as well. So I will introduce our next speaker. If you'd like to switch your cameras off, and we can move on to the next slide. So I'd like to introduce Ben Carlisle. He's Mott MacDonald's Global Practice Leader for DFMA. Ben is responsible for leading the global community of practitioners and for shaping the associated strategy and value propositions for this world-leading engineering, design and management organisation. He's a chartered civil engineer with over 15 years experience in the construction industry and has worked across a range of sectors and geographies, including the UK, Singapore, Australia and Taiwan, with roles in the multidisciplinary design and delivery of transport and social infrastructure projects. Most recently, he's been working with a £72 million government-funded construction innovation hub, playing a key role in the authoring and publishing of the product Platform Rulebook, as featured in the Cabinet Office's Transforming Infrastructure Performance's Roadmap to 2030, and developed to support the construction playbook's ambition for the use of platform approaches. Thank you, and over to you, Ben.
Thank you, Claire. So good afternoon, everyone. I'll give an update of what platform approaches are, what they represent, and how they contribute to helping our industry respond to some of the challenges and opportunities that we've heard about this afternoon already from Mark, Matt, and Ryan. In particular, I guess how we can find a practical way to adopt more lean and productive approaches in construction while recognising the variability that we face from project to project and the somewhat unique role that we play within society. Let's see if I can get the slides up on. So probably won't dwell a huge amount on these because I think it's been covered by others already, but probably just to say, since people first started making things, I guess inherently we try and find better ways to do it, and particularly sort of industrial revolutions have triggered massive transformation and change in automotive, aerospace, consumer product manufacturing and so on, but construction's sort of been slower than other industries to reshape itself and adopt new ways of working and new digital technologies. I guess you could think about a time traveler coming from several hundred years ago, arriving today, and how much of what they saw around them would they recognize? How much would be familiar? I think construction would be largely it, probably. If we consider the changes in vehicles, smartphones, even food, agriculture, we still use bricks and sticks quite a lot. The scale might have increased from the sort of medieval crane to Big Carl down at Hinkley Point in the UK, but design drawings aren't all done by hand anymore, but they still convey pretty similar information in pretty similar ways. And we definitely don't get it right using these approaches either. So the Get It Right initiative, research by them suggests that up to about 30% of all of our project spend, mainly in time, but time and materials, is spent fixing errors which crop up along the product development and delivery process. So we could probably fix quite a lot of the problems that we're facing, or challenges that we're facing, just by getting it right first time. If we set that, as we've heard from Mark, I suppose, if we set that against some of the huge pressures that we're facing, if we start with demand, this certainly isn't going away. So we've got both bigger population and more urban populations, and greater demands for quality of life. So there's an increased demand for building and infrastructure, both in the UK and globally as a whole. In fact, this is roughly equivalent to all of the built environment in Australia and New Zealand every year for the next 3 decades. So if we set that against the increasing shortfall in resources, both the labour resources that we've heard about, as well as sort of financial and environmental, then we do definitely need to find a slightly different paradigm, a different way to balance everything. I mean, I suppose I don't want to beat up the construction industry all the time, because we do deliver some of the most impressive feats of human endeavour, enabling safe generation and transmission of electricity, for example, spanning obstacles, man-made and natural, to allow transport systems to work, building huge sort of one-off towers in incredibly constrained sites, massively complicated assets such as hospitals that effectively outsource functions of people's bodies. But set against this backdrop of demand and supply, our current levels of digitization, productivity, effective use of money and resources don't really seem to cut the mustard. So policy is definitely trying to help, and there's been this sort of steady stream for going on for 10 years, which have sought to steer the rather large, unwieldy ship towards a better and more sustainable future, but none of them have quite yet tipped the balance. So throughout the period, construction's often been compared with other sectors, so manufacturing, automotive, aerospace, sort of chief among them, people who make lots of things. But I guess it's fairly critical to recognise the differences between those sectors and ours, not to excuse construction, but to understand which aspects we can and should pinch with pride, and which are maybe less appropriate or need a bit more thought to map them into our context. So one of the key challenges for construction is the need to balance variability, be that sort of policy or location specific, or ground conditions, site constraints, aesthetics and planning, whether we're dealing with existing buildings or building on greenfield sites, with repetition. So this is sort of the need to be able to do the same thing predictably, reliably and efficiently. The latest publication in this lineup of policy and documentation is Transforming Infrastructure Performance, so this roadmap to 2030, which sets out a vision for the built environment and how it should be treated as a sort of system of systems, so lots of things interconnected, that considers the built environment together with the natural environment and the services that sort of operate on top, that connect the harder infrastructure to the softer people who use it and rely on for society to flourish. This is done through these sort of 5 focus areas that set out on the right, and each of them highlights a slightly different challenge, but there's a common thread that runs through them, which is this need to balance sort of variety with repetition. The third theme in particular is addressing how we might go about addressing the need for social infrastructure using a platform approach, and this sets out really a key piece of learning drawn from other sectors about how we might go about addressing that balance. It's then reinforced by the construction playbook, which is hopefully people are familiar with, but it's a sort of comply or explain for public sector procured projects, and represents a sort of collaboration or compact between government and industry. But within that is this section saying clear intent that we'll look to procure construction projects based on product platforms. So these platforms provide a stable core configured and combined with complementary components via defined interfaces to suit a particular project. So all fancy words, but what does it mean in practice? So kitchens are a pretty good example of how this works now, how we get this balance between sort of repetition and variability. So we have carcasses, feet, hinges, dimensions, production methods, installation methods, all of those are the same pretty much everywhere, regardless of the system you buy and where you buy it from, unless it's completely bespoke. But they have to respond to a huge amount of variability. So the doors can change. You can choose different style, different color. You can change your work surface, change the finishes, change the lighting. You have to tie in with existing plumbing and the shape of the room and windows and so on. So there's it finds a way to do this, to sort of achieve this balance cost effectively and at scale. I think if we zoom into the kitchen, then even I guess we can even start considering a sandwich as a form of platform where we've got these sort of common repeatable things, but and some defined interfaces that can be combined in huge numbers of ways to tailor to individual tastes. So platforms then are really a method of finding this balance between repetition, which serves all sorts of purposes, but predictability, productivity, quality and cost control chief among them, with variability or with variety, which is really recognizing the need to customize the output, customize the product, customize the building to suit a specific client or project or site requirements. And it does this through these sort of 4 elements listed at the bottom. So the range of assets include the components, so the physical parts, but also the processes that go into the creation and the moving and the connection of those parts. The know-how, so actually knowing how to execute these processes and what to do with components, also needs to be sort of repeatable, ideally, and then the people and relationships to do it, because there's no point having a standard set of things that no organization can be contracted for or knows how to actually execute or be trained in, I suppose. So to enable improvements in the development and use of platforms through the Construction Innovation Hub that Claire mentioned during the introduction, we've collaboratively developed and published this document, so the Product Platform Rulebook. This has been funded by UKRI as part of the Transforming Construction Challenge, and I've been fortunate enough to have been one of the technical authors of the document. There's a QR code if you want to access a digital copy, but what it does is sets out these sort of 5 areas. So the fundamentals of platforms: what are they, why would you use them, what are they for? The context, so really building on what I've just been talking about in terms of policy. The rules and principles, so what makes a platform and what makes it good. A fairly large section around guidance, which is really the process to go through to develop and deliver these approaches, and then finally a set of examples which are sort of real world existing systems which just provide a bit of specific context and concrete examples. And critically, the focus is on enabling improved delivery rather than actually saying this is the one approach that we should adopt for everything all the time. It has been developed through, well, it's been predominantly industry driven and done through consultation with both government and industry. We had 2 rounds of consultations. This started back in 2021 to scope out what it needed to be and what it needed to do and for whom. And then a second consultation earlier this year, which was really to get feedback on the initial release. And as I said, this consultation included both government and industry, so individual organisations across architecture, engineering, contracting and manufacturing, as well as detailed interviews with individuals, organisations and consortia who have developed their own system. The need for this rulebook is sort of explicitly mentioned and reinforced by this policy document of transforming infrastructure performance. The aims are very much in line with the theme of this conference, I think, and Claire's opening remarks. So really we're trying to sort of support the development and use of consistent structure, rules and language to facilitate shared understanding and to set the framework for and inform the development of platforms and the configuration of different kits of parts, both of which come from these sort of policy documents. We're doing that through these 3 areas. So the educating part is talking about the principles and the overview. The empowering is really the guidance, so the framework that allows organisations and people to develop and deploy platforms, and then enabling through the establishing of rules and principles and some consistent language and approaches. Just delving into a bit more detail of those sort of key sections, and I'll go into the top 3 in a bit more detail, but maybe just to dwell on the bottom 3. So a set of recommendations which we're starting to follow through with in a subsequent phase of the hub's activities. The legacy, so how do we take the work that the Construction Innovation Hub has been doing around platforms and new approaches to design and delivery, and make sure that they're sustainable and useful and used, and that we can continue learning as an industry. So rather than a sort of digital copy of a document that we've worked hard on, just living somewhere on a website and gathering virtual or physical dust, how do we make it a sort of more of a movement and build some momentum around that movement? And then the examples which I've mentioned already. So just to draw some attention to some of the fundamentals, I think one of the key concepts relates to how we understand platforms. I guess it's a word that's probably used quite a lot, and it invariably means different things. It might mean Google as a platform, Amazon as a platform, the thing you stand on to catch a train. And there's more detail on this within the rulebook, but I just sort of wanted to call this one out, which really reinforces the distinction between the common repeatable elements, which is the column on the left, the variable elements, which are the pink ones in the middle, and then introduces the idea of derivative products, which are sort of a combination. So the common repeatable elements are both physical and non-physical, the things I mentioned a little bit earlier. They form part of the platform. So these are the things that we want to repeat because they provide us with either direct benefit, such as buying gains or productivity or automation or what have you, or indirect improvements. So they might be in other systems because we standardized interfaces or dimensions or tolerances, or a structural design which allows MEP systems to be more effectively standardized and pre-assembled. The complementary elements are those which respond to the sort of desired variability within a particular application. So these might include surface finishes on the facade panel to suit a particular planning requirement, while the core build-up remains the same regardless. So together those elements combine to create a range of derivative products representing I guess the number of different combinations that can be achieved, and they will vary according to the particular platform. But these derivative products target particular segments of the market or parts of the market. So they might include schools and hospitals, that could be those two boxes, or it could be category A, category B prisons if you're in a justice setting, or any other way of sort of like could be vertical and horizontal MEP distribution, for example. But by these definitions, I guess platforms can and should be viewed at a number of levels, depending on the definition of the product. So the product could be an entire building, or it could be MEP rafts, or it could be a lift, stair and service riser core. We're not prejudicing that definition at this stage. To add some more detail to those concepts, we've developed a series of rules which represent, I guess, the characteristics of platforms that need to be displayed to represent platforms and not just sort of highly standardized products. So the first two are really getting at the idea that they need to be usable across non-identical assets rather than just being sort of drag and drop or copy and paste. The configurable means they need to be we need to be able to range those parts differently in each one of those different settings to a reasonable degree. The common repeatable elements I've mentioned, but that's the parts, processes, know-how, and people and relationships. Interfaces is something that's come up in a bit of the Q&A already with Ryan and Matt, but particularly important if we're systemizing things, that we need to have defined interfaces made available to designers and suppliers of other elements going into that project, so that we can de-risk that interface and make it clearer about how different things go together. Quality standards, we need to know what that quality standard is, what it includes, what it doesn't include, so we can make better decisions and comply with things like the Building Safety Act. Structured information is recognizing the importance of digital technology in all of this, so really needing structured approach to information for both product information as well as how they go together and how they're used, as well as organizational information, so what capability and credibility are needed to make use of this system. The open rule is sort of optional, by which we mean it'll only apply in certain circumstances, namely when a platform seeking to describe itself as open. So this is trying to draw a bit of a distinction between two approaches to IP. And following consultation earlier this year, we've added a rule around circularity, which is recognising the opportunity for systemized approaches or platform approaches to construction, particularly if used at scale, to help us move towards more kind of circular economy within construction. And finally, the guidance is really the bulk of the volume within the rulebook, and this is setting out the activities which need to be undertaken in the development and deployment of platforms in construction. It's informed by quite extensive interviews, workshops, and a large amount of research. And I won't go through all of it now, but the basic idea is we've got these three areas or three domains. So demand is recognizing the need to look ahead and get a bit better at forecasting, to aggregate demand from multiple clients across multiple projects and look for the commonality, really. Develop is then being sort of strategic and planned in the approach, as well as then designing the system to target that slice or a slice of aggregated demand for a particular purpose. And then the deployment, represented by sort of multiple hexagons, I guess, is showing the repeated use, sort of configuration, production and assembly of the platform system across multiple projects. So in terms of sort of take up and future use, I guess it's worth reiterating this was only formally published in September of this year. And also only really marks the sort of the end of the beginning of this process. As we've heard already this afternoon, our industry takes time to change. Demand takes time to hit the market, and industry takes time to develop and deliver projects against that demand. And so the feedback on that delivery takes time to shape demand to enable further improvement and so on. That's not to say that nothing is happening. So we're seeing the use of platform approaches across a pretty wide array of asset types, from sort of MEP through to schools, which is sort of Gen Zero from the Department of Education, into offices, accommodation and resi, and then into less sort of social infrastructure things, so kind of substations and logistics hubs, as well as justice and healthcare facilities. So what might a project look like in this new approach? Picking up on Matt's comment earlier about the Value Toolkit, I think we see in an end state of this, or a future state of this, an ability to set and weight outcomes for a given project or need, which ends up being more sort of outcome focused. That allows the creation of, in this healthcare case, a sort of harmonized schedule of areas, so we know what the individual building blocks are for the facility, configured according to adjacencies and clusters of spaces. That allows a range of platform systems to be rapidly configured digitally against those requirements and assess assurance much more quickly than currently happens. There's then can be a stage of where that configuration is tailored, if required, based on the value set across multiple dimensions. Orders can be then placed based on proven compliance of each system, because we've got defined and known and documented quality standards, and then we're able to deliver that using sort of more known, predictable certain approaches, because they've been pre-engineered and systemized, taking a lot of the risk and chance of error out of the delivery process. Benefits for clients, it's quite a lot in here, but I think depending on the method adopted, we definitely see things like speed and reliability, and similarly certainty and predictability going up using this approach. Certainly in other sectors that use platform approaches, time to market, so the ability to generate new derivatives or new configurations is much quicker than we currently have, because the production method is sort of pre-integrated with design. And there's a potential for greater flexibility of the supply chain as well, because it can be sort of pre-identified and pre-selected and predetermined. On the supply side, picking out a couple of these, this sort of the reduction in mistakes will improve effectively productivity and should improve margin. The certainty of sort of larger forward order books and the ability to sort of forecast and plan better allows better development and investment in training, as well as capital, so as well as machinery and equipment, which sort of just provides more certainty to the business cycle, and maybe tries to get rid of some of the issues that Mark was highlighting at the beginning of the session. From a hub point of view, what we're doing next, we've got a series of work streams looking at these areas on the left. So looking at the sort of economic and organizational change needed to make platform adoption commercially viable. So what needs to happen on the industry side. So how, for example, the tier 1 organizations need to adapt and change, and why, and what's the benefit for them and what are the challenges for them, as well as the sort of broader implications for the structure of the industry, and what other accompanying policies might government want to look at, and the role that it might need to play. We are developing more detailed case studies through additional workshops and interviews with organizations who have existing systems, actively engaging with departmental clients on the implementation of platform approaches through the rulebook, developing some work that we started around deployment manuals, so really setting out how anyone developing a platform system needs to articulate that system to a project team for it to be able to be considered at the very early stages, at sort of strategic outline case and outline business case stage of a public project, and compared with others, so that decisions can be made earlier and final business case stages can be accelerated. And finally, as I mentioned, the sort of legacy and governance strategy for this agenda. I guess if you're interested in the subject and want to help us improve this, there's plenty of scope. So I think around shaping the legacy to make it useful and usable by industry more broadly is critical to the success and sustainability of this agenda. Of course, feel free to use the rulebook. It's there as a sort of open resource. There's no fee or barrier to using it. But what we would ask is that there's some route to share learning and feedback, help us with case studies if you've used systems like this or are aware of systems like this that industry would benefit from knowing about. That would be great. I've included a QR code at the bottom which you should be able to scan, and I think we'll be pasting the link into the chat a bit later to sign up effectively for that support. So thank you for listening. 2 QR codes, 1 to access the rulebook, 1 to register interest in supporting this going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was really great. And do submit questions if you have any, please. But I do have some questions. So the rulebook is currently a guide. I mean, it's only been published since September, and so it's pretty new, and people are only just using it. But I mean, is there a need to formalise it? Do you think at some point, or an opportunity to do that?
I think so. I guess yes. So yes is the short answer. I think there's always a risk of these sorts of things being developed in isolation and as part of an initiative. And I guess the clue's in the name, isn't it? To initiate is to start, and it needs a means of carrying on. So we don't want it to gather dust. And so I think there needs to be some sort of long-term ownership and support by either a mandate or a standard, or perhaps both. So yes.
I guess it'll be good to get some use of the document and feedback and so on
Yes.
over the next period of time. So another question. So a reason often cited for not using smaller offsite companies is that they go bust, and we've been hearing a little bit about that as well earlier. And others can't take up the work because of the unique approach of that supplier. And again, Matthew sort of mentioned that too. So is there a risk that we end up with too many platforms and them not speaking to each other, and ending up still basically where we might be in some ways at the moment?
Yes, so I think there's probably two broad approaches to that. I think one could be I suppose a command and control. So come up with one best way and mandate that for everybody to use, versus a second approach, which might be, I guess you could describe it as a bit more Darwinian. So allowing evolution, allowing systems to fail. And I think in that second case, I think we just need to make sure we can get enough consistency into requirements, metrics, performance measures, those sorts of things, and particularly interfaces actually, to allow both comparison and, if not interchangeability, then interoperability at least, so we know what we have and the implications of changing it, and then use incentives to try and drive convergence over time around those, while harnessing, I guess, the ideas that we know our industry can create and deliver from across many projects. And I think the rulebook, the strategy we've taken with the rulebook, is aiming more towards the latter approach, that kind of evolutionary approach. And we're, as I mentioned, with this sort of economic and sort of business change study that we're doing at the moment, we're looking into how this agenda might unfold and the likely implications for performance of the industry as a whole, to sort of inform how we take that agenda forward.
Yeah, I mean, and I guess that that begs the question: is this really for larger organisations? I mean, if there's going to be sort of inbuilt vulnerabilities, I suppose, is this more for larger organisations, or I mean, how do you see it take up with SMEs?
I think that's a good question. I think it could play out in a couple of ways. I think if it's more command and control, then you balance both the ability to control who does what, so the size of the organisation that's delivering what, but you also, I think, will encourage, you will make economies of scale more rewarding. And so I think there could be a drive towards more sort of vertical integration. But on the SME side, I think variability and lack of consistency and clarity in requirements tends to create quite a big problem, because if you're always having to deal with a different request, then the burden on that is sort of higher. And so I guess it's a bit too early to talk about sort of whether and to what extent it will drive vertical integration, adoption of SMEs, but we think as more platforms emerge, there'll be more confidence in pipeline and more stability and more rationalization of requirements, technical requirements that is, which will lower barriers to entry in particular areas.
Yes, that's the smaller sort of parts, isn't it? And skills has come up a lot, and obviously a major driver in this sector is workforce shortages. But are there any plans around training for this approach that you're aware of?
So there's definitely a recognition of a need for a slightly different skill set using this approach, but I think there's probably some nuance to it that we haven't yet got to the bottom of. I mean, it's an area that the Offsite Alliance and the Supply Chain Sustainability School are doing some, and Offsite Ready have done some really good work just to try and raise the floor, I suppose, with skills and understanding and language. On the other hand, I think greater use of platform approaches will affect skill sets we need, some of which will be easier to train for repeating the same across multiple projects, while some might actually be harder since we're quite a project-oriented, kind of craft-based industry traditionally. So definitely more work to do in that area.
And the last question quickly. So where is the best source of information about the range of pre-manufactured components and assemblies currently available? Is that something you can make any comment on?
So there are a few attempts have been made at these. I think Mark Farmer actually has just launched one in conjunction with a software company called Cope, looking at sort of trying to map and understand MMC solutions. But I think it's a gap. It's a gap at the moment. You can look at things like BOPAS and other sort of accreditation bodies who have lists of suppliers and associated products. But there's probably more work needed to do to understand the systems that are already available and who supplies them.
All right, thanks very much then, Ben. That was really, really good and really informative. And yeah, I think getting this out there, getting it embedded into industry is going to be really useful, and get that feedback and so that the whole system can improve. And as with any standard, and this is a sort of perhaps an informal standard, that you're constantly improving it and sort of getting it close to correct or perfect. All right, thanks very much then, and I will look to close now. So yeah, I think that was a really good and interesting afternoon. I think the key takeaways for me are that problems with the workforce within the built environment is still really there, and it really does need action to be addressed. And this is one way. Use of offsite construction is certainly one way of addressing that. I think the importance of net zero also came through. Actually, it was certainly mentioned, and as going to become so important. And there have been claims in this area about the benefits of offsite and energy savings and so on. But there is clearly a lot of work needed to prove those claims, and that is something that definitely needs to be done. Interesting, I thought that 60 to 70% of jobs already have a proportion of MMC. I mean, I think that it's here, it's happening, it's growing. I think that the standards world needs to respond. I think performance-based standards becoming more and more needed. There is a lot of work to do, and even though it is a potentially dangerous time for MMC. There has been so much turbulence and the cost of living crisis and supply chain issues. But things are generally moving in the right direction, that house builders are bringing offsite in-house. There is an increasing success on the MMC supply chain. But we really do need to address the skills gap, and skills are really needed. But I think on the positive side, you know, there is support for the sector at the highest level on both sides of the political divide. So it is time for all the work that's been going on in the last few years to move forward. I think that on the standards side, the national and international standards development will have a big impact over the next decade, nationally and across the international markets. I think this game-changing work that's been done on the platform approach, you can really build and actually work to the next milestone and either move to formal standards or whatever is needed, whatever is perceived to be needed by the industry as it becomes embedded across the built environment as a whole. So it's 5 to 4, but I think I will close by thanking the speakers very much. Mark Farmer, Matthew Egan, Ryan Colker and Ben Carlisle. And of course, thank you for attending this afternoon. I hope you enjoyed it. Yes, there's lots of seminars and webinars coming up next year. So do visit the website there on the screens. And that's me, Claire Price, saying thank you and goodbye.